Hey everyone, welcome to Metatopia panel, where we're going to be talking about games and specifically, should games make you feel bad? My name is Tam, and I'm a game designer. I've been designing board games since I was 10, and I do software and technology professionally. And later in my life, I got into educational gaming. So I'm coming to this from an educational game perspective. And I want to talk about this topic with my panelists here. If the panelists will introduce themselves, that'll be awesome, starting with Doug.
Cool. Thanks, Tam. I am Doug Levandowski. I am a freelance game designer, both tabletop card games and RPGs. Recently, I've done Kids on Brooms, Kids on Bikes, Aunt Agatha's Attic, and the forthcoming now it's called Duel of Wands. That's right. I'm also, in my day job, a high school English teacher, but I do not design educational games, which Tam and I have talked about a couple times. But yeah, how about we kick it over to Jessica?
Hey folks, my name is Jessica Creane, and I run a small game and immersive design studio called I Can't Go On, Games and Immersive. And I also teach game design at Drexel University and CUNY City Tech. So very much in the education about games as well as serious and impact games. So most of our work is about taking really complex subject matter and making it playful, which does not always feel good. Play is one thing, fun, enjoy, very different.
And the last panelist, but not the least, is Roberta. And if you're wondering why you cannot see Roberta and just a still image of her, it's because the video feed keeps crashing. So we decided to go with the still image. But we don't know if it's actually Roberta or not. It might be the Android copy of Roberta. So, well, maybe that's a game that we can determine.
Yeah, good evening. My name's Roberta Taylor, and I design mostly board games, and it started as a hobby, but I've been really, really interested in the intersection of games and big ideas, and so the sort of subject that falls under like meaningful play or serious games, things like that. And so I've designed a number of games for different clients along those lines. Again, tackling those big serious topics in a manner that's impactful through play. So that's my perspective.
Awesome. All right. So as I was saying, educational games came later in life for me, but I've played games all my life. And one of the earliest games that I played was Monopoly. And everybody has, I'm sure, a love-hate relationship with Monopoly. It is extremely popular. And I want to start with that as an example of a game that you certainly feel bad. Most people, while playing Monopoly, feel really bad. But is that really design? Is that intentional or not? And I'm sure Monopoly is very well known. So what do you guys think?
Monopoly, just the word Monopoly makes me feel bad, for starters, like right off the bat. But also just knowing the backstory of the game, I can't help but sort of link those things in my mind. Certainly playing Monopoly as a kid, I was like, what is this madness? And why am I no longer friends with my friends? We were friends 2 hours ago. We're not friends anymore. What happened? Monopoly happened.
You got through a game in 2 hours? That's amazing.
I'm pretty sure like 6 people rage quit. I mean, is that really getting through the game? Who knows? But also just the designer of Monopoly, she made this game, Elizabeth Maggie made this game as a game to combat monopolies, to teach people about what monopolies do to neighborhoods. And so it got totally co-opted by a man who played the game in a parlor setting and was like, you know what, this could be mine. And he just turned it into the exact opposite game that it was supposed to be, sold it to Parker Brothers. Parker Brothers did end up buying it off of Lizzie Maggie also, but they told her that they were going to present the game exactly as she had designed it. They lied to her. And so she sold the rights for almost nothing. And then they turned around and made this other guy's version of the game. And he's the one who's credited for making it. So it just so the bad feelings, I think, are like there from, oh gosh, someone please help me out with the dates. Early 1900s, maybe even late 1800s. Is that right?
1903 to be exact.
1903. Yeah, there we go. Yeah. So the bad feelings go way back on this. But I think in terms of design, like, is that a design choice? Kind of. Parker Brothers made a choice. The designer, the second designer of the game, made a choice to make players feel better about monopolies. And in fact, like what that did in the time maybe was make people feel a little bit better about having some power and control where otherwise they didn't have power and control. But nowadays, it makes everyone feel worse. So there's this time element that I find really interesting about the game. That nowadays, when people have learned the story, Monopoly starts feeling even worse than it already did, which was pretty hard to do in the first place. Yeah. I'll stop talking for a while.
Roberta,
no, I knew some of the backstory, but I didn't know all that. That's fascinating.
Yeah, thank you. That was really fascinating, and I've learned so much more about Monopoly than the blurb that I was reading. Roberta, what are your thoughts on Monopoly? Do you think that the design goal was to make people feel bad? And from the educational standpoint, do you think it achieved its goal about teaching about Monopoly?
It's hard to know what the design goals were, just being in such another time and stuff. Like you can see what the original designer was going for and whether or not that ended up. As far as players coming away with that, I think that this is a thing that's been on my mind as I've been thinking about this, is that if you're designing a game for impact, for emotional impact, for hoping that the players walk away with something, I think that it's really important to consider the sort of post the conversation, the debrief. And if you don't have something to say, you feel really gross right now, let's talk about that. People just walk away with this vague sense of, well, that wasn't very nice, without necessarily having picked up on share. So I think that of course, and I doubt that Waivers language or thinking around that available at the time, but I think that part's missing to make it actually be impactful.
And Doug, since you are a self-proclaimed cynic of educational games, what is your impression of Monopoly? Do you think it is an educational game? And do you think it achieved any educational merit?
So I've never played it in its original form, so it could work really well as an educational game in that form. I think in its current form, it's not. It feels good to win Monopoly, right? It makes the goal the thing that you're trying to teach people not to do, and I think there's some serious cognitive dissonance there. Mm-hmm. It's sort of like trying to get players to take on the role of being in a satire, which I think satire is really, really tough and requires, I'll try not to get too English teacher on this, but requires like a lot of very careful authorial choice. And I think when you're playing games and your clear, explicit goal is to crush your opponent, it's really hard to make that a learning experience where people come away thinking that this is what has just happened is bad if they win, right? Mm-hmm. There's the great line from 30 Rock where Jack Donaghy comes over to see his girlfriend and says, I know you're stuck here, but I brought dinner and Monopoly, so there's no reason we can't have a good time unless I lose. And so it feels bad to lose, but it feels good to win, right? I consider myself a pretty good person, but I've convinced opponents in Monopoly to give me their favorite pen instead of going bankrupt. Mm-hmm. And then afterwards felt bad and gave it back. But in the moment, I was like, yeah. Mm-hmm. So no, I mean, as it stands, I don't think it's successful in a design to make us feel bad or to convey what it's trying to convey.
It's almost that there's no repercussion to winning winning badly in the sense that you're not winning bad, but you're doing so well that other people are obviously miserable, but the game doesn't do anything about that. There's no repercussion to it, other than maybe the social, maybe the intention that you should feel bad because you're winning so much. But as Doug said, I don't think that's usually the case in a lot of Monopoly games.
And I think what Roberta said was great about the lack of the debrief, right? That there isn't that time to say, here's what the goal was, here's what we were hoping you would take away from it. Talk about how it felt, and having to hear, if the four of us played Monopoly and you won, Tam, and you had to sit there and listen to us talk about how it felt to have to go around the board knowing that we were losing, knowing that there was realistically no way we could win, but we had to keep playing, that might help. But instead, you just pack up the board and pull out a deck of cards and play Pinochle or whatever, right? So,
yeah, I think that works for the yeah, I think that's true for the people who are losing the game. Also, a debrief would be really helpful, because the way that the game is currently structured, it makes you feel bad for not being better at playing the system. And the person who plays the system the best is the one who wins. And, due to, human biases, most humans have this bias that, if I win, it's because I'm really good at this thing. If others win, circumstances were for them. That luck was with them. The wind was with them. And if we lose, it's like, oh, well, the circumstances were against me personally, otherwise I would have won. And the person who's winning, it's all luck based. So there's this weird tension between, how am I doing as a player? Am I playing the system right? Should I be playing the system right? And in Monopoly, players who are losing end up feeling bad because they didn't play the system well. And I don't know that I really want people walking away from Monopoly thinking, really, the problem is me. I need to get better at playing the system. That's not, that to me is a bad feeling message.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of debrief, games that are really good at debriefs are lobs. And I know that a bunch of you are very familiar with lobs. Roberta, you have done a lot of lobs, right?
No, I've done some role-playing games and that have had extensive debrief, but I've actually never had the privilege of playing a LARP. So,
are there any role-playing games that are really good at teaching, but also help you deal with difficult emotions?
So the game that I played that I think has a lot of relevance to this conversation. I haven't. I'm very new to this. I played my first role-playing game at the first METATOPIA I attended. I think it was 3 years ago. So it's a new world. But I had the privilege of playtesting Rosenstrasse by Jessica Hammer and Moira Turkington, I believe. My apologies if I got the names wrong. And it's a game with some really, really heavy content. You're playing these families in Germany during the Second War, and you're playing people who may be Jewish, may not be Jewish, may not have known they were Jewish, maybe in mixed marriages, and things happen. And it's a sensitively done game, but it's also almost impossible to play it without crying. It's just got so much emotion. And so with that, of course, there had to be built in this really well done debrief, and as well as checking in and whatever. But what that really did was, part of the experience was processing what just happened. It wasn't an add-on, it wasn't tacked on, because I think even with something that's not quite necessarily that emotionally heavy and that sort of loaded historically, you've still got I think it shouldn't be an afterthought. I think when you're trying to convey a big idea, it makes sense to sort of think about how you're gonna help people process what just happened as you build that experience. And I thought that they did a really good job with that particular one.
And is the debrief part of the rules in the game, or is that something that people do?
Sorry, I missed the first half of that question.
I was asking if the debrief portion, is that part of the rule set of that game, of how you actually play it, or is that just something that people do naturally?
No, it's built into the rules essentially. Like when the person who's running the game, that's a part of how they do this. It would have to be a decision on the part of the person running the game to ignore the direction of the writers to not do that. And I can't imagine any player wanting to do that experience without that.
Right.
So yeah, it's just like, it's a part of it. Here's what you're going to do to set up. Here's what you're going to do. And here's what you're going to do at the end. And that's the game itself. Like, it includes that.
You were asking about LARPs, Tam?
Yes.
I still remember the first LARP that I ever played. I played a pharmaceutical executive, and we were tasked with figuring out how to. Nope, that's not true. We were not tasked with this. I suggested this in character, that we start marketing our product more to children, and coming up with like just diabolical ways in which we could get our drugs into the bodies of kids. And it was pretty stunning to me how naturally it came. I was like, oh, these bad ideas, these good bad ideas are just flowing straight out of me. There's never been an outlet for them before, because I've never engaged this part of my brain before to really think evil. And that...
Oh, go ahead, please.
It made me feel terrible. It made me feel terrible while playing the game. It made me feel terrible after playing the game. Even thinking about it now, I have this little twinge of like, oh, I'm capable of things.
Mm-hmm.
And it feels bad to know that I'm capable of those things, or how easily it came to me. And the debrief is really what helped settle me, knowing that everyone else in that space had also gone through a similar experience, or was able to speak to those effects. And I feel deeply now like I am capable of evil, and I actively choose it not to use that part of myself, and that feels good. So the game made me feel bad, but the effects of the game have made me feel empowered.
Mm-hmm. And for those who are not familiar with LARPs, LARPs are live action role-playing games. Those are, well, maybe somebody can do a better description of what a LARP is, since I've only done a couple in my life, and they've all been really amazing. One was where I was a Syrian refugee, and the other where I was on a shipping trawler that was sinking and everybody's going to die. So they're all... The ones that I've done are really tough subjects. So another notable game is Train. That is by Brenda Romero's Train. And if you're not familiar with the game, it's a board game where you are... It's sort of like an efficiency game where you are moving little meeples in a train. But maybe somebody can tell a little bit more about the game.
Sure. Yeah, so there's a glass window pane that is laid out, and the game is placed on top of it. And so you can see that the game sort of looks unique even just as you walk up to it. And there are these little train tracks across the glass pane, and also these little trains. And so you have to put these little meeples. I haven't actually played it. I'm just speaking from like having heard her talk about it. But you have these meeples, and you have to fit them inside the train, and they're just like a little bit too big to fit easily. And so there's like a little bit of a struggle to get them in. And then you are engaged in the gameplay of trying to take the train further along the path all the way to its terminus. And when you reach the terminus, if you reach the terminus, you realize where you have been bringing your little shoved in meeples. And they are all extermination camps, World War II extermination camps. And so it's really all about this idea of what do we do because we're not thinking deeply about the world. And I don't think that it's necessarily based on this, but I do a lot of philosophy work. And so Hannah Arendt, who's a philosopher around this time, she talks about banal evils. And how was it? She's really said she was a German Jewish philosopher. And so she was really looking at how is it possible that evil can happen in the world? And she really chalked it up to these, what she called banal evils. It is everyday people going about their jobs without necessarily questioning the things that are happening. And so I think about this a lot in the contemporary form, but this game is really touching on that. What are we not asking? And do people stop playing the game once they know what it is? To which the answer is, for almost everyone, yes. They will stop. But they will also not tell anyone else what the gameplay is. They just wait for them to figure it out. So that's Train.
Yeah, and I love that explanation about the banal evil. I'm from Burma, and I grew up in a time where there was a lot of civil unrest, and it's you get the sense that everybody believes that they are good. They want to do good, but it's really difficult to actually do something. And I'm guilty of that myself. And I can, games like that, but also life experiences also makes me realize that it's really difficult to do the right thing. Sometimes you don't know when is the right thing to do. When do you do the right thing? And maybe part of some of these games, are they educational? I don't know. Maybe they'll make you more self-aware about who you are. What do you guys think?
I mean, I certainly think that's a kind of education. I think one of the critiques I've heard about Train, and I've never played it myself to know how it feels, and now I couldn't because I know the twist. But one of the critiques I've heard is the issue of consent in gaming. That where does the role of my choosing to buy into this come into play, and how do we draw the value of the lesson that could be learned from it, which I'm sure is quite powerful, but how do we balance that with exposing someone to something like that without any warning about it? Mm-hmm. Right. So in the role-playing space, where things are more free and can go in more directions, safety mechanics are really, really important, right? And content warnings about what might you see in this game. I just put out a journaling game where you have a mentor who has different priorities, and based on those priorities, there are questions that come up. And so before playing, we included a set of possible content warnings, right, based on the questions you may see. And I think those are probably more important, just for the player's safety and well-being.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm couching that by saying probably. It depends on the impact. If there's a way after you play Train to debrief and talk about that and think about how you can take this lesson forward, and what, an explanation from the creator why it was important to do this, then that might be different. But if it's just like and based on what you're saying, it sounds like the intent was very much to educate and to get people to think about the banality of evil. But I think there have to be things in place so that it doesn't feel like a haha gotcha, even if it wasn't meant to be that, right? If someone can walk away and feel like, well, I just had the rug pulled out from under me, and I was tricked into doing this thing. I think there's a real danger there.
Yeah, I think there's something to being in a receptive state, right? And when you're designing experiences, games or otherwise, we want to make sure that the people who are utilizing that experience are ready for it. And so there's, we usually do a certain amount of onboarding and a certain amount of offboarding if there is sensitive subject material, but it's all design work, right? We can set that up. And so, yeah, this question of consent, I mean, the designer of Train actually said, someone walked up to the game and was like, oh, I see what this is. I don't want to play. And her response was, you already have. Mm-hmm. So there is something to just, yeah.
Roberta, do you have any thoughts on, I really like that thought of the consent part, because it's something new to me in the terms of tabletop, like strategy board games. There's no board game that come with consent warning label. or at least one that I know of. Like I had a similar experience where I've been working on. I designed games, strategy games with a little bit of evilness in it, I guess, or questionable matter. Like one of my last games it's Moon, where you are playing a Soviet bureaucrat and a corrupt Soviet bureaucrat from 1969, and during the middle of one playtest, somebody had to stop because they were so triggered by having to do corrupt things, and he was coming from his own life experiences, and he had to stop. And this was the genesis of this panel discussion, that it made me realize, okay, maybe people should be made aware of what this game is about. What do you think, Roberta?
I think there's a lot of content that really deserves that kind of thought. And I think it's that whole deliberateness. Like, as a designer, everything you do is a choice, right? And I think it's our job to think those things through and to listen to our playtesters and to do the work, so that, you know, you can't know every single potential thing that could be difficult for somebody coming into a game experience, but especially when you're dealing with harder subject matter, whether you're trying to deal with it lighter way or in a much more, I want you to walk away and think about something new. I think that's really our job, and it's lazy of us to just be like, whatever, people figure it out. It's like, no, how do we make this to be, you know, and I think part of it is that respect for the player, and that, you know, things like the consent, and part of it is respect for the subject matter. Like, if we're going to go to all this trouble, well, let's have the best impact that we can with that effort too. But yeah, that's why that's our job as far as I'm concerned.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the more games lean into having narrative and telling the story, the more important it is to have that, right? So I'm trying to think of a good example. One of my games, Aunt Agatha's Attic, is about cousins squabbling over stuff that their aunt is giving them. And I think that's important for people to know going in. That's right up front. So if somebody says, I was just in a really nasty dispute with my cousin, I'm out. Good, right? It's not like they do a bunch of setup and then it says, okay, now the fighting starts, right? Or spell duel, right? Just from the name, you know that you're going to be fighting people with spells. Yeah, right. And I think the more narrative we put into something, neither one of those is a particularly narrative game, but the more story we put into it, the more invested our players are going to be in that narrative and in that story, as opposed to just the mechanics. Mm-hmm. The more important it is for us to warn them.
Right. Yeah, and going back to the Romero's Train game, I think it would be pretty difficult to put a content label on it, because part of it is that shock value. And I don't know if that's, what do you think? Do you think it's valid to have these kinds of games, or should it have some sort of content label?
I think it's super valid. I think it's tricky. I don't think there's a way to make it always work for everyone. But I think that has to be the case sometimes. We are artists. We take the unknown into our hands every time we create something. We're always learning. It's always an experiment. And so I think it's important to be able to support that. Otherwise, we don't grow. Also, the world is full of surprise and uncertainty. If we weren't contending with that, what would we be doing? You know? Also, like, chance gets built into games all the time, you know, through role play, dice rolling and all kinds of other stuff. So the idea that things will come at us that we don't expect is very deeply embedded within games. The idea that those things might be upsetting is a little bit less primed. But the truth is, that's changing nowadays too. You know, the more games sort of make their way out of just high fantasy world and really into much more about, like, we have so many games now that touch on reality or touch on this kind of material. So part of it is really just like, what is this conversation that we as designers are having with the public in general? How are we all getting largely educated about the kinds of things that we're going to be experiencing? So in some ways, we're just sort of setting up this a little bit of a paradigm shift also for our players. And as Roberta was saying, like, that's on us as designers to help shape that conversation and lead the way, and really be leaders in that space and say, okay, this game really does need some content warning. Or there's like a more subtle check-in, like, hey, if you're going through anything where you've been feeling emotionally up and down, you might just want to know that this game may do the same. I've done a lot of things in World, so I design immersive experiences as well as tabletop games, mobile games, digital games, pretty medium agnostic over here. But the immersive theater in particular is tricky because you're bringing people physically into a space. And so there have to be rules that are set out for the protection of everyone involved. And so I think that there are this balance between, like, when we give them information is interesting, how much do they need out of world before we even say, you know, welcome to this playful experience? Do they need to know things like don't touch anyone else in the space unless, you know, they consent in X, Y, and Z way? That's generally best done out of world, because otherwise, if it's in world, then there are loopholes. Oh, my character doesn't abide by those, you know? So there are certain ways in which when is the information doled out? Can you actually get to the middle of the game and start seeding the possibility that things are going to get darker? I think yes. I think that that's absolutely possible, but it really comes down to the specific design and the care, and do all of the players know and feel that they are in good hands? Mm-hmm. This is a designer who's been taking on a journey, and I trust this because I see that they are being thoughtful about all of these choices, versus this feels like a totally badly chaotic experience in which I don't know what's going to happen and I fear for my safety. So I think it's about the ways in which we start opening people up through experiences.
Mm-hmm. And I want to, maybe board games can start to have the kind of like the warning labels or age appropriate labels that movies and other media have. So moving on to another game.
Can I just add one thing to that?
Yes.
I totally agree. And I think the more that games move into the realm of being considered art, the more we expect art to surprise and upset and unsettle us, right? I don't go into a film expecting that I won't be troubled or moved, right? But if I sit down for a game called, you know, like Jumping Pigs, I expect it to be fun and lighthearted. And so I think it's to some extent, a question of expectation, but I think there's also the sort of, it's more than just expectation based on title. I think it's expectation based on what you assume from the medium, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. When I'm working on a meaningful game, I'm very, very aware of my intended audience, and I would hope that in any case that would be fairly clear in the finished game of who is this game for. While that's not an explicit content warning, if it's marketed at grade 4 to 7 students, I'm going to expect different content than something that's clearly aimed at an adult audience. And there's cues there and stuff, because I think that comes back to that expectations being appropriate at the get-go.
Mm-hmm. Right. And another game, or another couple of games that I want to talk about. Well, one of my favorite is Imperial by Marc. And Imperial is very similar to a much older game called Diplomacy. And I'm sure you've all heard of it. I don't know if you've played it. But Diplomacy, it takes like a day to play. And it's all about conquering the world, but you have to do it where you have to make alliances only to usually backstab them later to be the ultimate winner. And after like 12 hours of play of this, I felt so drained and horrible of having to backstab people. That's a game I actually don't want to play again because it left me with such a bad taste. Imperial is something similar to that, but I personally enjoy Imperial more. There's not so much of that backstabbing. There still is, but you don't outright lie to people and do terrible things. What have you? What are your thoughts on either of the games?
I've played neither, so I don't
Okay.
know.
Yeah,
I haven't either. I'm terrible at strategy. Games. I can strategize in life.
But the underlying topic about having to lie in a game and then be the ultimate winner, use that, leverage that, games are supposed to create this safe space, I guess, or a magic circle. Some people like to use it. Although, is there still a magic circle? I don't know. That's an ongoing debate. But I see you shaking your head, Jessica. What?
I just agree with you.
Yeah.
I think that we play games because they affect our lives.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm still on the fence on that. I think there's, because we come from educational background and we play game, we make games so that it affects our lives. So we are ultimately trying to break that magic circle. But a lot of people believes that there's this magic circle where what happens in the game stays in the game, and if the rule says it's okay to do something, it's fine. What's your thought on that?
I haven't played those games because, well, firstly, I don't own a poker face, so I would be horrible at them. But I also think it comes back to that thing of consent, where is this like, if I know up front that's what this game is about, and that seems like something I would enjoy, that's very different. Whereas if I find myself in this position where, I have to betray my teammates now in order to go on, if I didn't knowingly choose to have that type of experience, I'm just going to be really disappointed and upset because that's a yucky feeling, and I'm not interested in exploring that and I think that for some people that sort of, it's my mind against yours and we're going to see who can do this the best, they really enjoy that, and they have the ability, I think, to kind of separate that from real life. And for those folks, maybe those are great. For myself, I think I would just be miserable the whole time. And so knowing ahead of time, this is probably not an experience for me, because there's no greater understanding that I think I can gain to help me in other parts of my life from that. Whereas maybe someone who's a diplomat might find just the idea of how do you talk to different people and maybe that's an abstract exercise they could learn from. I don't know. I can only speak for myself there.
Well, and then games like, Among Us is one of the most popular games right now, right? Or, Mafia, Werewolf, even poker. Those are games all about lying to your friends, right? Tam, you want to drop out? I'm holding 3 aces. Right? That's the buy-in, right? Like Rebecca was saying, it's all about the consent, right? When I sit down to play poker, I consent to being lied to in this game, right? But often with the very real world stake of I'm going to lose money if you lie to me successfully. I'm going to walk away. I play very low stakes poker, $5 poorer, right? If you totally wipe me out. But I think it all comes back down to the expectation and what you've bought in for.
I think that's very true. But I think the difference between, say, poker and a game like Diplomacy is games like a lot of strategy games, there's a lot of bluffing and hiding your actions. That is part of the game. But that is done through mechanics of the game rather than, say, in Diplomacy, what you're really having people do is, it's more real to life because you're talking with people, you're getting them in a room discussing strategy, and you are actively trying to lead them astray, and that you're going to have to take them down, but you kind of have to lie to them straight to their face and get them to trust you, only to be dealt that blow later. So I think for me that was the difference between a game where lying is involved but more mechanical, but diplomacy where it is more lifelike.
There's a game that I played. I think it came out within this year. It's called Scapegoat, and it is a social deduction game to an extent. Basically, like, you are playing as this den of thieves, and one person has to take the fall for the bank heist you just pulled. But because of the mechanics of the game are set up in a certain way, everybody knows who the scapegoat will be. Everybody knows, except for the scapegoat. But the scapegoat knows who the scapegoat is. They're 100% sure who it is. It's just not them. So if 6 people are playing the game, 5 people know the correct answer. 1 person knows the false answer that they feel to be correct, exactly the same as everybody else. So no one has to lie to each other, but it's the same feeling. Everyone is rooted in their own truth, knowing full well that they could be the one that's wrong. But they have nothing really to do but exist in this game as if they are correct. And so it breeds this crazy anxiety. Like I'm like, well, the last time I played, people were like getting up off the table, like just kind of like, is it me? Will someone please just tell me if it's me? Someone please tell me. But it was so delightful too. Like it was so, like, people were just like sweating. I was like getting up to like drink a glass of water because I was just dying on the inside. It didn't feel good. Like, anxiety doesn't feel good, but at the same time, it's compelling. And so I think that's sort of like, it's the truth in this game and the lies in other games are this same sort of like world building experience of like, what can I get away with in this world? And so the desire to like push boundaries and stay in it is so strong that even if it feels bad, we have a desire for something else beyond that is bigger than that, which is the desire to win. So winning in our minds is so rooted to good feelings that it's hard to even separate those things. And I think that's really interesting. Like these moments when winning feels good, but we've done terrible things and felt terrible things to get there. Like that momentary switch is fascinating to me.
Roberta, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Sorry, I don't have anything to add to that.
No worries. I want to, in the interest of time, I want to move on to a couple of other games. One of them is Spirit Island, and there are other games like that, like a CO2 is another game. Spirit Island by Eric Roos. It's a game. It's a strategy game where you are playing the spirits of the island, and your goal is to drive off the colonists that are attacking the island. So it's a game with an ecological bent to it. So is CO2. And there are a bunch of other games which talks about learning about the environment, but also making you aware of maybe your role in ruining the environment. Any thoughts on those games or any games like that?
Spirit Island is hands down my favorite co-op right now. So yeah, what I love about that is, and it's interesting that it's in here for like a game that makes you feel bad, because it makes me feel great. But what's interesting about it to me is that it makes me feel bad about playing Settlers of Catan, right? So what I think is so cool about what Roos has done there is it inverts our expectations of a different game. And I think that's just such a cool move. Yeah.
I love about Spirit Island is it's the least subtle thing I've ever seen. Like, it's absolutely non-apologetic. The little colonist pieces are crappy plastic while everything else is beautiful wood. And it's just like, it's not hiding the fact that it wants you to think about this, but it also does it in such a way that you're like, I'm really glad I played that. That was a really interesting, and it does make, like you said, it's a great point to turn the other games on their head. And it really, your expectations of so many board games are, I'm going to come in here and I'm going to conquer this land and colonize it. And you're like, wait a minute, this is not what's going on here. And I think in that sense, especially like the first time you play that game, it does have that element of surprise of, oh, this is what's going on. And as you play through it, it kind of just keeps driving that point home. And I do think that that's really interesting, and was clearly a lot of design choices went into making that experience work that way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with that. Just drawing the distinction between the two, also, it's just interesting thinking about how deeply in conversation all games really are, or a whole scene really is. But also, like winning generally, no matter what the win state is, it generally does feel good. But the learning happens when we lose, right? Unless you need to learn to be a more gracious winner, in which case I guess winning could be a learning moment. Yeah, we see you.
Yep.
But for the most part, like that is, for me, like that's the exciting space. So I'm also interested in how we reframe loss, as just this experience that is actually potentially much, much, much more deeply rewarding than winning, and sets us up in this like whole world of possibility. Like that feels like such a win to me. And so how we frame the endings of games, or even the importance of the end of the game versus the journey, all of that ties into how we ultimately feel about something and what feelings we're walking away with. And that can be, very much in the design of the game. Like we have the power to shape that too.
And speaking of loss, another game, a game about loss, is the Holding On. It's a co-op game by Michael Fox and Rory. And it's about death. So in the game, it's a co-op game, and you are basically going through the end-of-life experience of a bunch of patients at this hospital. And one of the things that you do in the game is that you uncover their memories of their life as they are going through the final days of their life. And it's really poignant. It kind of reminds me of that little montage at the beginning of Up, which is one of my favorite 10-minute sequence in all type of media. But it's the idea of building a life history of this character who is going to die. Any thoughts on games that deal with death, or this particular game in general?
What are the mechanics of Holding On?
The mechanics is, well, there are two mechanics, if I remember correctly. One is making sure that you are satisfying the needs of the patient. And you're kind of like a hospital administrator, and you have to make sure that you're staffing this hospital properly and going through various crises. So that is one of the co-op mechanics, and you're working with other people which over shared resources to manage the hospital. But the other mechanic is, as you're doing that, you are uncovering the patient's life, and they come in these cards that you can see in the photo, and it's kind of like a simple jigsaw puzzle, and they make a tapestry of their life once the game is completed. So it blends strategy, but it also has a very strong narrative feel to it, and it also dealing with difficult subjects.
I mean, that sounds great. I would love to play that.
Yeah, that's by Roy Connor. That's I think the company's Hub Games, and I had the chance of playing it recently, and that was really awesome.
It makes me think about just like games as training grounds. Games and experiences, interactive experiences as training grounds. This is a chance to test out something that you will maybe never experience in life, or that you will experience at some point You might want to be a little bit more prepared for it. I don't think that, I think it's a select grouping of games that can do this, but I think it's really powerful and helpful in a lot of ways. But I also know myself well enough to know that I wouldn't necessarily sign up for it. Sometimes I actually really do need to be sort of tricked into contending with subject matter like that. So if the game was presented to me as such a thing as like, okay, yes, it's a game about death, but you're really going to love it because of these unique mechanics. Even for someone who's deeply fascinating and invested in impact games, there are some things that I don't always want to play through unless I know there's going to be something else to hold on to. And so I think that that's why the design becomes really important, is that there has to be a way for us to really make sense of the world and not just be lost in narrative grief the whole time. And I've seen enough gameplay. I've actually seen gameplay of Holding On and thought it was beautiful and really beautifully done. And so I think finding those meaningful mechanics, those like metaphorical actions that I can take that will help ease me into understanding something better. That's what I really look for in a game that contends with death, or something that I have personal experience with and need to guard myself a little bit on.
Right. And so another thing that I want to throw out there is, and this is where I met Jessica as well, as it's Games for Change, which is annual event that happens in New York, and we talk about games that are designed for social change, and there are digital games, board games, all sorts of games, and lately VR games. There's a lot of stuff happening in VR. Have you guys tried VR, and what are your thoughts on the impact of VR in terms of educational game and games that can drive emotion?
Waiting for the technology to stop making me motion sick.
Yeah. I haven't gotten motion sick yet. I've definitely done some things that have made me think. It's rare that a VR experience makes me feel, or to feel in a lasting way. I think I have a better visual memory of the experience than I do a lot of games, even video games that I play. There is definitely a sense of embodiment that I have after experiencing them, but the world feels so fabricated to me a lot of the time because the technology is still catching up to the kinds of stories that we can tell now. And so there are sometimes moments of transcendence, but I think they're out there. I just haven't played through them yet. So I'm really excited to see as more stories come into VR, how powerful they can be. There's a lot of 360 video stuff that I've seen that's been very powerful. There's also Tree. I guess Tree comes to mind as a really impactful VR experience. And part of that is because it is also a kinesthetic experience. You can play now at home on your home VR set, and you wouldn't have certain elements. But if you play through Tree in the right settings or in a public where it's being publicly shown, then you have this VR set on, and you start out as a little seedling in the dirt, and you grow up and become a full tree, and you can move your hands like the branches move, and so you're embodying the existence of this tree. And then spoilers here, there is a deforestation comes encroaching on your section of the forest. And so at a certain point, you become disembodied. You are removed from the tree and just have to watch it burn. But up until that point, you are the tree. And so I think that's probably like the most powerful VR experience that, certainly one of the most powerful VR experiences that I've had. I'd say Queer Skins is another one. So I think that like there's just figuring out simple ways in which to root people in space and have that be part of the storytelling is so promising, and it also takes good storytellers. I'm really excited to see more writers be moving into the VR space and to see more VR projects bring writers in so that the story and the tech can all evolve together so that those things can really be heightened.
That's awesome. And I haven't tried Tree yet, but I now want to try it. Thank you for that. So
I forgot to mention. Sorry, yeah. I forgot to mention the live in person part is that like there's someone with like a heating thing, so you can feel the heat of the sun, and they've got a fan, so you can feel the wind, and so there's just like all of these tactile things to help enhance the VR experience.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. When Games to Change happens again in real life, I really hope they have more really awesome VR games like that. So. And so I'd like to just wrap up on this. This has been an excellent panel discussion. I'm so grateful for you guys for being here. Now, if people want to find more about you and what you're working on, where can they reach you or find you? Roberta, do you want to start this up?
Sure. You can find me on Twitter at Infinite Roberta. And that's probably the easiest place where I try to post some game stuff and talk about projects that I'm doing. Right now I'm 2 weeks away from my first ever Kickstarter launch of my game Creature Comfort. So I'm very excited. And yeah, so that's where I would be.
Doug?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter. My username there is Levzilla. I'm also just starting to put my stuff up on itch.io or io. I don't know how people tend to pronounce that .io thing, but yeah, those are the best places to find me. And I'm tweeting about the stuff I'm working on and other things as well. So.
You can also find me on Twitter and any other form of social media you like. Jessica Creane is my name and my company, and handle for everything is I Can't Go On, which I will spell for you because it is a deep cut philosophy pun that I'm constantly apologizing for, but also I love it. So that's at IKANT, like Immanuel Kant, KOAN, like Zen koans.
Nice. And my name is Tam, and you can find me on Twitter at Tam@Play. And also on Facebook under my name. Again, thank you, everyone, and thank you, Metatopia, for making this possible. And I hope to see you guys for some games and maybe in real life soon.
Yes, thank you for putting it together, Tam.